Historians have argued about it for generations, conspiracy theorists have obsessed over it, and mainstream textbooks rarely explore it with any real depth. I'm talking about a period that supposedly swallowed almost 1,000 years of European history into a fog so thick that many people still believe nothing important happened. But if you dig a little deeper, you discover a very uncomfortable truth. The Dark Ages weren't just dark because Europe fell into chaos. They were dark because entire institutions worked to control what information survived and what vanished. This isn't fiction. This isn't speculation. This is what happens when power meets the past and decides what the future is allowed to remember. And tonight, as you drift into a calm, curious state of learning, we're going to walk through the most misunderstood era in human history. Not with sensationalism, but with real evidence, real context, and real strategies for how to understand historical gaps that shape our world even now. Now let's get into the core story, because the darkness didn't come from nowhere. The narrative of civilization collapse was crafted long after the events. When people talk about the fall of Rome, they act as if the lights went out overnight and Europe stumbled into 9 centuries of silence. That narrative only survives because much of what we call the Dark Ages was written centuries after the fact by chroniclers who had their own agendas. Medieval monks, early Renaissance scholars, and church authorities shaped the timeline we now take for granted. They decided which texts deserved to be copied and which could, well, just disappear. They exaggerated Rome's greatness to make their own world look like a rebirth, and they downplayed the achievements of the so-called barbarians because, frankly, it threatened their worldview. Understanding this matters because, it teaches us one practical skill. Never take any historical narrative at face value. Always ask who wrote it, when, and what they stood to gain. The lost knowledge narrative hides how knowledge actually survived. We're often told that scientific, medical and engineering knowledge vanished in Europe until the Renaissance, but that's nowhere near accurate. Engineering, continued in the Byzantine Empire. Mathematics advanced in the Islamic world, and, agricultural and trade networks just kept evolving across northern Europe. What truly vanished wasn't knowledge itself, but rather specific knowledge the Church didn't deem worth preserving, or in some cases actively sought to remove. Medical texts involving anatomy, philosophical works that challenge church doctrine, and astronomical theories contradicting religious teaching. These often didn't survive. This wasn't randomness, it was selective preservation. And, modern survivalists can apply this lesson directly. Store your knowledge locally. Don't rely on institutions to safeguard it. Redundancy really keeps knowledge alive. Power decided what was worth copying, and the rest quietly died. Before the printing press, every book had to be copied by hand. A monastery might produce only a handful of manuscripts a year, so choices had to be made. Those choices shaped the future. Texts on warfare survived because rulers needed them. Theological texts survived because monks valued them. Meanwhile, entire libraries of engineering, ethnography, pagan philosophy, early medicine and local history vanished simply because no one copied them. If you want a modern comparison, think about digital preservation. If a server goes down or a company collapses, huge amounts of information disappear. The practical takeaway: knowledge is fragile unless you protect it yourself. You know, historians, preppers and researchers today often keep physical backups of critical information for exactly this reason. The Dark Ages weren't dark everywhere, just in the places where records were controlled. If you step outside Western Europe, the so-called Dark Ages turn into centuries of innovation. The Islamic Golden Age, for example, produced breakthroughs in surgery, algebra, optics and navigation. China advanced military engineering, paper production and statecraft. The covering-up effect comes from assuming Europe equals the world. It never did. You know, the story isn't really that civilization collapsed, but rather that Europe lost its dominance and later on rewrote history to make it seem as though the rest of the world was just standing still. So a practical application here is actually quite simple. Diversify your sources. Whenever you're studying anything, whether it's history, survival strategies, or even medicine, make sure you look at multiple cultures. One culture's weakness might just be another culture's innovation. Now, here's a more uncomfortable truth. Some of those gaps in our knowledge were, in fact, deliberate erasures. Many early medieval kings went so far as to destroy the records of their predecessors, all to legitimize their own rule. Churches, too, suppressed heretical texts that didn't fit with established doctrine. And you know, entire ethnic histories were sometimes overwritten by victorious tribes. When folks say the Dark Ages are mysterious, well, the mystery is often intentional. The practical takeaway for anyone today is really quite crucial. History is political. If you want to get at the real story, you absolutely must compare sources, study archaeological evidence, and always try to understand the power structures behind each narrative. Studying the Dark Ages teaches us how to read between the lines. This is where the historian becomes, well, a detective. You look at surviving architecture to map lost skills. You analyze trade goods to trace cultural contact. You compare oral traditions with archaeological layers. Anyone, whether a casual watcher or a field researcher, can use these methods. For example, when evaluating any historical claim, always check the material evidence, the political motivation of the writer, and the timeline of when the record was produced. This practical process will help you avoid myths and uncover hidden truths no matter what topic you study. The Dark Ages weren't empty, they were edited. That's the short answer to the supposed biggest cover-up. The darkness isn't a void, it's a controlled narrative. And once you see that, you understand how fragile our historical memory truly is. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want more long-form history built for serious thinkers, subscribe to History Reborn Alive and share this video with someone who loves discussing the past as much as you do.